Rob Rakove is a lecturer in the International Relations program at Stanford University. He received his PhD in history in 2008 from the University of Virginia, and has held fellowships from the Miller Center and Ohio State University and the University of Sydney. He's presently at work on the history of U.S.-Afghan relations in the decades before the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
Thank you. I'd like to echo my fellow participants' thanks to the festival, to Bob for hosting. As a graduate of the local corporate department in American history, it's delightful for me to be back here. I've already had my requisite 2 slices of Christian's pizza, and I'm looking forward to snowy Charlottesville time, regardless of the weather in Charlottesville. So with all that said, I'm going to divert us from present events and to the intricacies of Dutch-Indonesian negotiations over Western New Guinea. I jest, but I am conscious of being a bit more historical than my peers in terms of going back into that distant conflict we call the Cold War. But I would actually like to frame this in terms of issues that have present-day implication. And I think a number of questions that were present in the Kennedy-Johnson policy toward much of the post-colonial world, much of Africa and Asia, are questions we can dwell upon meaningfully today. And I'll introduce them, but I'd like to actually beg your indulgence as I read a few short paragraphs from the book. On November 23, 1963, Egypt entered a state of mourning. The city of Cairo, in the words of an American diplomat, was overcome by a sense of universal tragedy over the death of the United States President John F. Kennedy. As the embassy counselor reported, 1,000 Egyptians came to the embassy to write messages of condolence. Many were prominent citizens, including an influential member of the Presidency Council named Anwar al-Sadat. Others, though, were ordinary Egyptian citizens. The diplomat wrote, "The expressions on their faces left no doubt concerning the genuineness of their sorrow. Mourners remarked that Kennedy was the first American president who really understood the Afro-Asian world. In the Egyptian media, journalists who were normally critical of the United States declared their heartfelt sense of shock and grief over the event. An editorial in the daily Al-Ahram stated that Kennedy had transformed the United States from the, quote, repugnant rich brother to the, quote, cherished rich brother of the human family." And Egypt's grief was not at all exceptional. One can find its analog elsewhere in Ghana, in India, in Indonesia, in Algeria, which felt a special bond with Kennedy after his 1957 speech in favor of Algerian decolonization. And I came upon all this early on in my research at the John F. Kennedy Library back now in the summer of 2006, at a time when the United States relationship with much of the post-colonial world, much of the world, frankly, seemed quite different, when it seemed to be full of excoriation. I think even allowing, I think, for the very, I think, interesting and telling notes of nuance that my colleague here has just introduced, it struck me as improbable that Americans could be spoken of, American leaders could be spoken of at that point in time, as Kennedy had been at that point. And it begged the question, why? And I was already engaged at that point in a broader project of trying to understand Kennedy and then Johnson's policy toward much of the non-aligned world. And so in the course of the study, among several others, I wound up focusing on a number of questions. One of them was maybe more purely historical, a question around the decade that I was focused on. Was the rift that followed, was the acrimony that soon followed November 1963, within a year American facilities in places like Egypt and Indonesia were being attacked by angry mobs. A few years later, much of the Arab world severed relations with us in the immediate wake of the 60 War. Was that acrimony avertible? Was it something that was fated to happen, or was there maybe an adroit change of policy, perhaps a continuation of what had struck me as a fairly prudent policy on Kennedy's part? Would such a continuation of policy have averted this rift, which in some ways foreshadowed the acrimony of the 21st century, which in some ways planted the seed for it? Scholars like to look at questions like that and ask if there was a road not taken. And this was a question I dwelled upon, although as with all such questions with Kennedy, the answer is painful and uncertain because there's simply too many hypotheticals interacting with each other in that post-1963 timeframe. But thinking about the present day a bit more actively, I found myself looking at the role that presidents play as head diplomats, Kennedy met with an awful lot of people, particularly early on in 1961. Most famously, he had a very nasty two-day summit with Khrushchev in Vienna, which he subsequently regretted to some degree. But he also met a host of non-aligned leaders, of leaders from recently decolonized and not allied, not necessarily friendly states throughout Africa and Asia, from Ghana, from Indonesia, from India, from Tanzania. And we have a debate today about whether presidents should shake hands with unfriendly leaders. Kennedy would not have really wasted time on the handshake question. He thought it was important to not only shake the hands of these gentlemen, but also to engage with them in frank discussion. Often acrimonious discussion, but one finds after the fact that they tended to welcome his candor, that if he stated his opinions forthrightly and said why he thought what he did, even if it was in conflict with what his guests might want, there was a degree of interpersonal respect, often in the absence of any real friendship. He could not stand Indonesia's Sukarno, who he thought was this volatile demagogue, but Sukarno never caught a whiff of that, which I actually find a very interesting statement about Kennedy's interpersonal skills. But also, I look at how presidents work as administrators. And again, this is a topic that's in the news. We've had, of course, some Daily Show and other outlet publicity about Obama's ambassadorial appointments. But also, Bob Gates' important new memoir has a lot to say about how the Defense Department existed within the Obama administration, how it existed in the administration. And here again, I think there are important conclusions that actually give us a sense about how each president really is their own person as to how they approach this vast government apparatus that they've come into possession of. And the Kennedy-Johnson difference, both in terms of organizational predilections, the way they deal with subordinates, but also in terms of personal policy preferences, it's very stark, despite the fact that they're coming from the same party, despite the fact that they've both been in the Senate together. They had very different inclinations, and they acted upon them in ways that were, at least in this instance, I think deleterious to a policy that Kennedy had crafted, which Johnson allowed to be dismantled. I would also ask a kind of broader question, and it's one that again resonates up to the present. How well do we deal with neutrality in the world? Americans were neutral for the vast majority of our independent existence. American neutrality, broadly speaking, was terminated with our entry into the Great War, but then reasserted very vigorously, very energetically for the interwar years following that. It was the dominant fact of the American engagement on the world stage before the Second World War. And then after that, however, I think a very different attitude toward neutrality and non-alignment, which is a very slippery, often defined concept. And the more defined it is, the less clear our notion of it is. Americans have been less tolerant of it. In the Cold War era, the prevailing notion was that there was something immoral about countries that wouldn't choose sides in this great all-consuming battle between freedom and slavery. That there was something fundamentally morally wrong with not seeing the struggle as we perceived it. More recently, of course, there's the question of you are with us or you're with the terrorists. And in fairness, it's very difficult to be truly neutral in any sort of struggle, particularly one between state and non-state actors. But it's an interesting paradox that Americans, having practiced neutrality for such a long time, may not have room for it as much anymore. And I think that's a question that's going to be even more salient alongside these others as we appreciate what a complicated world, what an increasingly complicated world as of these last few weeks we have found ourselves in. And so while I do hope that this book will speak to the long-standing and deep interest in the Kennedy and Johnson administration, I also hope that it'll have perhaps some relevance in more contemporary and I think equally difficult times. Thank you.